The Dodecahedron. The German is stubborn, even in his vices. He himself calls it loyalty. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, AD 98. Darkness would soon descend, damp and heavy. The three praetorians needed its cold protection if they were to leave the mire of the moldering forest and reach the camp alive, for darkness made the enemy blind and vulnerable. "Oh, you gods, for what do you punish me?" groaned Princeps Marcus Aurelius softly but audibly as the praetorian Quintus Sempronius, at his master's command, entered his chambers. At first he believed the princeps wished once again to lament the unconquerable pains in his skull, which afflicted only one side of his head, but that side all the more fiercely. It turned out, however, that Quintus Sempronius had been summoned to receive a most confidential order. It concerned an enterprise of immense importance in a land whose name he had indeed already heard, but which he did not know from his own experience. A land as foreign to Rome in every respect as it was distant from the political power center of the world. In Germania, such was the will of the princeps, a settlement near the Saltus Tudobergiensis was to be scouted, and there an object was to be seized and then brought to Rome, whose significance could not at present be fully put into words, but whose possession would without doubt decisively influence the fate of the world power. "Go, find it, and bring eternal peace and prosperity for me, for you, and for the whole Roman Empire," Marcus Aurelius murmured one last time before, tormented by a wave of especially stabbing pains beneath his skull, he withdrew into his private chambers. Creeping cold began to seep into their bones. Rain set in as well, at first only heard within the forest, then, as they left it, also felt as it lashed slantwise against their faces. In the distance, smoke was rising. "Follow me, the settlement is up ahead." Titus Calpurnius and Numerius Gavius, likewise members of the Praetorian Guard, made no reply. Rather, the three men trudged on wordlessly through the tall grass, which swayed irregularly in the gusting wind. Now the sky, too, was in motion. The cloud formations veiling the stars showed their first rifts, and almost at the same moment the rain began to slacken. Between the dissolving clouds, the full moon emerged from the dark blue-black of the sky. In the glow of its pallid light, the Germanic settlement lay in a small hollow. It had nothing of the refinement, beauty, and deliberation of Roman settlements and cities. Small huts with low-slung roofs that reached almost to the ground, erected without any order discernible to a Roman eye, seemed at any moment about to sink into the muddy earth. Where paths ought to have been, there was only trampled mire and muck. It reeked of urine and dung. A barrack, larger than the surrounding huts and fitted with a flat roof, stood out on the northern edge of the night-gray cluster of low dwellings. No doubt this is Hadgan's settlement. It is exactly as the scouts described it. In Quintus Sempronius's words lay neither relief nor satisfaction. "It is too bright, the moonlight spoils it." "Do not despair, Numerius, but be mindful of the importance of our task," Quintus Sempronius admonished. "Let us move closer and find out how well the enemy guards himself." Bent low like Nubian lions on the hunt, the three men crept through the billowing grass, their eyes fixed unceasingly on the enemy's dwellings. A drawn-out cry, half human, half animal, shameless, rumbling, and coarse, made the Praetorians pause. None of them cared to admit it, and still less did their pride give them cause to make it known to the others. Yet every one of them shuddered at the dark, bestial call. "Is that him?" whispered Titus Calpurnius in a hushed voice. Quintus Sempronius raised his head and listened toward the village. "He is not with Hadgan. He is over there." He pointed with his hand toward the north, to the edge of the settlement. "They believe themselves safe. We shall have to pass his dwelling. We shall have to flee from him, or even, if need be, fight against him." "So what is it you mean to tell me?" Quintus Sempronius replied. Titus Calpurnius fell silent. Numerius Gavius, too, said nothing. Quintus Sempronius drew himself up. He now spoke more audibly, almost too loudly given the nearness of the enemy camp. "I remind you who we are and what oath we have sworn. The oath, in every situation and every danger, however it may be constituted, to risk our lives for the preservation, prosperity, and growth of the Roman Empire, indeed to sacrifice them, so that we may thereby attain everlasting recognition and honor. But this oath did not go so far as to bring our wretched physical existence to safety at the slightest sign of danger, and thereby to harm the endurance and glory of the empire. The other two raised their heads and murmured their assent. "It is well," said Quintus Sempronius. "I merely wish to assure myself of your loyalty and steadfastness. Only the foolish man knows no fear." Then, under his lead, they stalked on toward the foreign settlement, and soon reached the clumsy barrack with the flat roof. A faint gleam of light seeped through the cracks of the rough structure. Then, now clearly louder, came screaming and groaning that seemed to issue from two throats at once as pitiable as it was repellent, so that it made the blood curdle in one's veins. It came without doubt from the larger barrack directly before them. Quintus Sempronius stopped, then ventured closer and cast a glance through a crack. What he saw was not much, yet it was enough to make even a brave and daring fighter like himself, one accustomed to the sufferings of war, recoil at once. The torso of a Roman legionary, robbed of both arms, writhed in the red-stained paws of a gigantic mountain of flesh. "What did you see?" "Something terrible, the Colossus." Quintus Sempronius said only what the three of them already knew. Then he tried to collect himself. There was no use in speaking of what exactly he had seen, nor did they have time for it. They had to press on. "That is where we must go. Hadgan's dwelling is only a stone's throw away." Quintus Sempronius pointed to a hut standing somewhat more freely in the middle of the settlement. Wrenching themselves with difficulty from the rumbling and groaning, Titus Calpurnius and Numerius Gavius followed their leader. Guards were nowhere to be seen, at least not near the hut of the tribal chieftain, which they reached unhindered. For a moment longer they paused, listening and scanning their surroundings. They knew that after this, there would be no turning back. Everything now had to go quickly. No mistake could be permitted, for it would mean their end and the failure of their mission. Without a word, Quintus Sempronius tore open the door. In the faint glow of the embers, he made out two children, a boy and a girl, who lay huddled close together by the fire pit in the middle of the room. On the opposite side, a young woman slept, and not far from her, an intertwined couple. The man could only be Hadgan. With a single sword stroke each, Titus Calpurnius skillfully killed the sleeping children, who otherwise would at once, with their uncontrollable screaming, have alerted the village's inhabitants to the intruders, while Numerius Gavius stabbed Hadgan's secondary wife. As Quintus Sempronius approached him and his chief wife, Hadgan had already been woken by the movement in the room. In one motion he at once reached for the sword lying beside his bed and for an object beside it. But Quintus Sempronius had already recognized his opponent's intent and struck off his hand with his sword. The Roman had to allow Hadgan one first brief howl of pain before he struck the head from both Hadgan and the woman. Then they paused, as though they first had to grasp what a bloodbath they had wrought. Titus Calpurnius was the first to raise his voice. "They are dead without telling us where it is. How are we now to find it?" he asked, agitated. Quintus Sempronius knelt beside the beheaded Hadgan and reached for something lying on the floor. Princeps Marcus Aurelius touched his temple almost tenderly, yet that did not keep his face from twisting into a grimace contorted with pain. Clad in a white cloak lined with purple, he sat otherwise as motionless as if carved from stone. Only his lips moved fleetingly as he spoke. "Quintus Sempronius, you are the first among equals, the bravest among the brave, the best of the best." The princeps looked at Quintus Sempronius as though expecting an answer from him, but it was surely the pains in his skull that halted his words. "You are as dear to me as a son," he continued, more softly than before. "Never would I place your life in danger without good reason. But now such good reason exists, undeniably." With clouded eyes, Marcus Aurelius gazed at his subordinate and was silent for a time. Then he began once more. "The Roman Empire, in all its power, greatness, and beauty, is inescapably doomed to ruin if a Germanic leader, or any other enemy of Rome, comes to possess that which Hadgan, the chieftain of the Marsi, has long had at his disposal. You ask what it might be that teaches us fear and terror? Yet this question is not easily answered, for we know too little of the object and its powers, of their origin and their extent. The only reliable sources of our meager knowledge are the oral accounts of a few surviving legionaries, confused and disordered to be sure, yet in agreement, both among themselves and with the childish prattle of the Germanic barbarians. Certain it is only that this thing exists. For how else would these savages have been able to wipe out 3 glorious Roman legions so cruelly? Marcus Aurelius drew his cloak more tightly around himself, as though he were cold. Whether it was owing to the tormenting pains in his skull, or to the incapacity generally ascribed to him of expressing himself concretely and precisely, he was able to convey to Quintus Sempronius only the form and nature of the mysterious object and where it was to be found. Of its capabilities he said hardly anything more. Go and take with you the most loyal, the bravest, and the praetorians dearest to you, those who know no fear, neither of their own death nor of the enemy's, and who understand the craft of death so masterfully as no one else but they. This is it. Quintus Sempronius held aloft a metallic-seeming body whose surface consisted of 12 regularly shaped pentagons, each pierced in the middle with a hole. "How does it feel?" whispered Titus Calpurnius, while he stared at the object. The metal of the dodecahedron was dull and dark. "Strange, like iron, only much lighter, there is a trembling within it." Titus Calpurnius pointed to the dead Hadgan. Why did he not carry it, if it grants so much power? "It is said that it robs the spirit and soul of whoever carries it upon himself, but is not conscious." An animal scream, louder and more dreadful than any they had ever heard, welled into the hut. It was at once followed by the first excited human sounds. "We are discovered, away from here." Quintus Sempronius, the dodecahedron in his hand, was the first to leap from the hut. The others followed him. At once the experienced praetorian grasped where the voices were coming from. Flight along the path that had led them into the village was out of the question. In the Colossus's hut, movement could be made out through the slightly opened door. Men swarming about restlessly were busying themselves with chains that still held something monstrous captive. From the west, a handful of men rushed wildly toward the 3 Romans. Dogs barking could be heard. "After me," commanded Quintus Sempronius, and began to run eastward. Only a few huts further on they would reach open, though to them, unfamiliar, terrain. After that, the gods would have to stand by them. Quintus Sempronius fairly hurled himself into the tall grass of the fallow meadows, which stretched as far as the eye could see. Only here and there did weathered oaks rise like motionless, monstrous sentinels from the swampy ground. They heard the voices ever more distinctly, and the bellowing of the Colossus, too, sounded nearer than before. So Quintus Sempronius began to run as fast as he possibly could. He did not wish to stop until he and the dodecahedron were safe, even at the price of his lungs bursting. And indeed, the voices of the men, so near just a moment before, and the on-rolling fury of the beast, sank surprisingly quickly into the pulsing roar in his ears. Even the boggy ground, giving way beneath every step, was no longer any hindrance to him as he ran. Titus Calpurnius and Numerius Gavius, by contrast, were scarcely able to follow Quintus Sempronius. He was the most capable among them, certainly, but that he should simply outrun his comrades in arms was not to be expected. The further and faster Quintus Sempronius drew away from Titus Calpurnius and Numerius Gavius, the nearer the raging villagers and the fearsome monster seemed to close in on them. Its mighty steps made even the yielding ground quake. Too fast was the mad creature for the 2 Romans. It had long since outstripped the Germani like a bloodhound that had caught the scent. Now it was hard on the heels of Numerius Gavius. He felt its foul breath on the back of his neck, and with the courage of desperation, tried to dodge and weave in the manner of a cuniculus. But the gods did not mean well by the praetorian, for the misshapen Colossus, at least over 10 Roman feet tall, made one last mighty bound, seized with one of its huge paws the one arm of the desperate Numerius Gavius, lifted the man into the air as effortlessly as a child its doll, and then tore out his other arm as though it were the delicate wing of a butterfly. The monster's horrific fury allowed the abused Praetorian only a brief yet marrow-shaking scream. Then it severed head from torso, and thereby Numerius Gavius from life, by ramming its tusk-like fangs into its victim's throat. Titus Calpurnius had earlier deliberately taken a different route than Numerius Gavius to make pursuit by the enemy more difficult. Now, having veered off at an angle from his friend Numerius, he heard, after only a short time, the man's shrill scream. But he did not turn around the hunted man, and that was right. For every halt, every hesitation and wavering, however brief, endangered his life still more than was already the case. The monster, however, had already come right upon Titus Calpurnius. How could this be possible? With a single brutal blow, it hurled the Roman several feet away. He fell, accompanied by a pitiable howl and blind with pain, into the mire. He came to rest on his back, badly battered by the mighty blow. The last thing the brave Titus Calpurnius was to see in this world were the beast's feet flying toward him and finally crashing down upon him, far larger than his head, which pressed him deep into the muck so as to bury him thus alive. Slime and sludge forced their way with all their might through every bodily opening into the poor wretch's body, until it was filled to bursting. What an outrage that, in this manner, the life of a man admired by all for his courage and his grace in battle should meet so unworthy an end. Quintus Sempronius halted at one of the enormous sentinel oaks, not because the running had taxed him so greatly. No, rather the opposite was the case. He felt full of strength and endurance. Nor did he halt because he had not known where to run. Before him, to the southeast, the first outlines of the beginning forest were already taking shape, which would offer better protection from his pursuers. It was rather that Quintus Sempronius felt that something, only what exactly, that he did not yet know, was other than it should be. He was faster than ever before, more enduring too, yet all this might be explained by a rising above oneself in the face of the importance of his mission. When for a moment he concentrated entirely upon his innermost self, he sensed what truly troubled him, namely, that great suffering lay ahead for his loyal companions, or had perhaps already befallen them like a deadly sickness. He did what he himself always warned against. He took time where there was no time, paid no heed to the enemy, although it sought his life with every means at its disposal. It was in the highest degree dangerous, and yet equally indispensable and necessary. He had to become aware of himself, otherwise he would become a helpless victim of his hunters. From the northwest, from the direction of the settlement, a shadow overpowering even at a distance approached at an imposing pace. Like a whirlwind, it swept through the meadows, flattening their tall grass, and now steered unstoppably toward the giant tree, which would surely grant Quintus Sempronius no protection. He judged that it was too late to flee. The colossus came rushing on at an unconquerable speed. So Quintus Sempronius resolved to seek refuge behind the trunk of the weathered oak, which measured perhaps 8 feet across, and to hide there as best he possibly could. Indeed, the monster seemed not to notice him and ran with undiminished speed toward the tree. But it had scarcely passed it when it abruptly slowed its pace and finally came to a stop. Testing the air, it raised its broad, monstrously large and long nose, whose tip was missing, and greedily drew the air into its quivering nostrils. In doing so, the beast turned its head in every possible direction to seize upon whatever it was seeking with the help of its nose. Gradually it moved back toward the oak. Quintus Sempronius realized that he hovered in the greatest danger. He pressed himself as tightly as possible against the oak's trunk and prayed to the gods. The colossus meanwhile crept slowly around the tree, the thick bulb of its nose ever raised on high, as though the Praetorian had vanished into thin air. Now it stood, perhaps only 3 or 4 feet from the hunted man, its back turned to him. Quintus Sempronius pressed himself against the fissured bark and already had his hand on his sword. At any moment the monster would notice him. Then at last the colossus turned and looked directly at the Roman. Yet it showed no reaction whatsoever, only stared blindly through Quintus Sempronius as though he were air, growled threateningly, and slowly turned its eyes away from the hounded man. Wherein this inability to perceive Quintus Sempronius lay was unclear to the Roman. He grasped at once, however, that he could turn the situation unexpectedly to his advantage, and drew himself nimbly up over the oak's low-hanging, thick branches into its crown. There, for the time being, he was safe. Agitated, Quintus Sempronius looked down upon the unsteadily swaying colossus, which circled the tree aimlessly. Thoughts of how he was to get away from here again came to his mind, but also the daring notion of attacking the colossus from ambush. What would it be like to leap onto the monster's neck and behead it with drawn sword? From the direction of the village came the tense barking of dogs and excited human voices. Now was no longer the time for hesitant deliberation. Quintus Sempronius had at last to act. He gauged for a moment the distance to the colossus, concentrated, and then let himself drop soundlessly downward, the blade aimed at its misshapen head. As hoped, just before his landing, Quintus Sempronius rammed his short sword, tested in countless battles, with the force of the free fall into the bare skull of the beast, until only its hilt was still to be seen. The colossus twitched a moment longer, swayed a little, and then fell like a felled tree straight to the ground, which received it with a smacking sound. Quintus Sempronius, meanwhile, as the monster had almost reached the ground, sprang deftly from its neck and rolled into the damp grass. So it was accomplished. The unconquerable colossus had met its master. But it was not as though Quintus Sempronius could revel in this sight. No, the opposite was the case. Shame rose within him at the treacherous deed. In that moment he saw the dead giant as an inexperienced effigy, indeed perhaps rather as a foolish child. Decency forbade him to draw his sword, rammed into the slain one from its skull, for that would have required him to set his soiled shoe upon its head, and thereby rob the dead of its last dignity. In any case, scarcely any time would have remained for it, for the human pursuers with their raging dogs came rolling threateningly on. Without a weapon, he saw himself compelled to flee. So Quintus Sempronius began to run once more. Quickly he drew away from the two giants, the one just now towering into the sky and seemingly full of eternal life, the other felled and soon to be the sport of worms. Only fleetingly did Quintus Sempronius still hear at his back the plaintive cry, "Irk," and the furious barking of the dogs. He reached the forest fairly quickly. Like a huge rampart, the densely standing dark trees bordered the meadows lying before them, as though they inescapably locked in the settlement and its inhabitants. The thicket he could no longer traverse at a run, far too little space was there within it. So Quintus Sempronius had to break off his run and from now on grope his way through the undergrowth. His pursuers, guided by the dogs, meanwhile came ever closer. Familiar with the terrain and the conditions of the forest, they instantly made up the distance to Quintus Sempronius, while he, tormented by the thorns and sharp twigs of the low brush, increasingly lost his bearings as to where it was best to flee. Ever denser and more pressing grew the voices and the yapping of the pursuers. They must already have seen him, were very close. Scarcely any time remained to Quintus Sempronius. He looked about and made out on the gloomy forest floor a fallen tree. Beneath it was a hollow, in itself too small for his purposes. He squeezed himself into it nonetheless, even though he could not fully conceal himself within it. Only a few moments later, the first dogs appeared at the spot with loud barking. Several armed men followed them immediately. Quintus Sempronius was surrounded. The dogs, to be sure, though they slavered scarcely a foot away from him, did look at him too, yet nonetheless seemed not to perceive him. The men lost themselves in an excited confusion of voices, likewise looked as if by chance in his direction, and thereafter turned their gaze away from him again without any reaction. Finally the pack, together with the heated men, left the spot and moved deeper into the forest. Quintus Sempronius breathed a sigh of relief. The tension fell away from him. He stretched a hand out of the hollow and laid it on the ground. Then he felt a gentle breath of air. A tawny owl landed on his hand. He stared at the creature and began, how strange that only now, gradually to grasp wherein the power of the Dodecahedron lay. Strength, speed, and concealment it granted its possessor. Unconquerable was he who possessed it. Unconquerable would the Roman Empire, would Marcus Aurelius, become. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic: hope not for Plato's republic, but be content if there is even the smallest advance, and remember that this result is no trifle at all. For who can change the principles by which men order their lives? Doubting thoughts rose tormentingly within him.